through
Sorry.
how it has affected travel through the aviation system, both nationally and at our two airports, O'Hare and Midway. With our first slide being our daily national TSA checkpoint throughput for all of our domestic markets. This slide has been updated through this past Sunday. And as a reminder, just the colors we have going on the image, we've got 2019 is the red pre-pandemic levels. Blue, light blue is 2020. Faded green is 2021, and yellow being our current 2022 numbers. As you can see on the left of the chart, for 2022, we're seeing a strong recovery since the wave of Omicron kind of came through in the end of last year and through January and February. But as we're coming kind of the other side of that wave, we're seeing demand really pick back up, especially at a higher rate than what we saw last year at about the same time. Since mid-February, national TSA throughput was at about 86% of the same period in 2019. So a really good sign that travel is beginning to resume to pre-pandemic levels. That being said, these are still predominantly leisurely travelers, business travelers that typically travel during the business week. We're still seeing numbers well below where we were in 2019, about 70 to 75%. Whereas the weekend travel demand, we're close to 95% of where we were pre-pandemic levels. So the leisurely traveler has definitely resumed flying. Business traveler is still not back to where we were pre-pandemic levels.
Chairman, it's Aaron. Just one more item of note. We got an industry article yesterday, I think, that Friday was the third busiest day for air traffic during the pandemic. I think that's a reflection somewhat of spring break and people's desire to get out and about. So just know that I think these numbers will go up for the spring period, and we will continue to keep you posted.
Yes, thanks, Aaron. And actually, this slide kind of highlights that spring break peak that we typically see. If this is the O'Hare specific TSA throughput for 2019, comparing through current 2022. In red, you'll see that spike there in March. That's that spring break spike that we typically see this time of year. We have not seen that in the past couple of years due to the pandemic. You'll see in green there, as well as where we were in March of 2020, heading in the exact opposite direction. But the yellow, you'll see that trend line definitely heading towards that kind of peak travel period that we typically see in March. So again, we expect to see that being highlighted, and we'll bring back those numbers at the next update. Similar to the numbers that we're seeing this month, last month, TSA reported that for February 18th, which was President's Day weekend, that was the busiest day of the year so far. So again, highlighting the definite return of the leisure traveler and resuming their demands on personal flights. Next slide is the Midway TSA checkpoint throughput, updated again through March. This is updated through last week. The red being 2019 levels, yellow being current levels. We did not, unfortunately, see the same kind of trend we saw at O'Hare. Southwest, of course, is the major airline at Midway. They did have to reduce quite a bit of their schedule through the winter months due to Omicron, as well as staff shortages. And so their schedule was greatly reduced. However, their schedule that they're reporting for the spring and summer months, we expect to be much more robust that we've seen. So not quite yet the same recovery we've been seeing at O'Hare, but we're optimistic that Southwest, based on their forecasted schedule for the rest of this year, that the passenger demand at Midway will trend upward. Next slide is, these are just operation levels, arrivals and departures, comparing our years here. For 2019, this is updated through February. We're at about 21% below the operation levels that we saw in 2019. Right now, we're averaging 1,772 operations per day, and that's about 30% below that peak 2,520 average operations that we saw in 2019. Again, but as you see, the trend is heading upward, and we expect that these numbers will continue to converge and be closer to 2019 than where we were in 2021. Same graph for Midway operation levels. Again, average operations for the month of February, about 15% below where we were in 2019. Average operations per day are 427, below about 33% below the annual average for 2019 of 636. This next slide is that kind of snapshot where we show a typical weekday or Thursday, comparing January Thursday versus a January Thursday in 2019, where we spread out our major domestic markets and categorize them on geographic region to give you some idea of what markets are recovering quicker than others. And the story continues to be the same, that the markets in the Southwest continue to see the strongest demand. Those are the greens and the yellows, as well as our dedicated cargo hubs like Indiana, Memphis, Cincinnati. Several of those airports really showing strong operation levels. O'Hare and Midway highlighted there in red, still kind of in the mix with our Northeast markets as well as Northwest markets. A lot of these markets are dependent on international travel. Again, the international travel is still not recovering as quickly as the domestic travel has been. So same story that we've seen, strong demand at cargo hubs and the South and Southwest regions. The next slide shows O'Hare's dedicated passenger flights and also dedicated cargo flights. Now, these are operations per day for passengers, passenger carriers only. And again, you can see that trend updated through February. These are operations per day. The comparison, we continue to expect that the operation levels to be at or well above where we were last year and closer to those 2019 levels. On the right side, you'll see the dedicated cargo operations specific. Again, we've seen throughout the pandemic, the cargo demand remains very high, and as expected, it's following that same trend line that we saw in 2021. And lastly, of course, just kind of the overview of system shocks and recoveries. The aviation system has unfortunately weathered some serious shocks over the lifespan. However, it's always recovered. We expect this one to continue to recover, although you can see that significant trench there for the 2020 and 2021 timeframes, but we're continuing to head in the right direction as we look behind us on the COVID-19 pandemic and its implications. And that completes the update on the COVID-19 impacts on operation levels.
Thank you, Ryan. So I think that when we added this back in 2020, it was clearly a single variable event was driving traffic at the airport down, which had the most significant impact on airport noise that we will probably ever see. As we're coming out of that trench that Ryan mentioned, it's clear that there are multivariables that are now impacting flight, whether that's business travel, variance, fuel prices. So if it's not a problem with the committee here, I'll do a call to the chair of when to remove this item from our standing list. I think at least probably a month or two more makes sense, but we probably should have an off ramp of when we need to stop analyzing this from a COVID perspective and start looking at it from the multivariable perspective that it is. Is there any objection to that? All right, seeing none, we will hand it off to Mr. Ickes.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. Ryan, just for point of information, does anyone keep track of the number of scheduled flights? It seems that during COVID, every plane was filled to capacity, and there might have been fewer flights. Is that a trend that we can expect, where there's fewer scheduled flights, but every flight will be filled to capacity? Because that would impact a lot of things. Full flights are going to be heavier, take longer to take off, and are noisier in the air. Is anybody keeping track of that? The number of flights that are scheduled?
Yes,
Thank
I think if I'm understanding your question and point correctly, that's something that's called load factor in the industry, the percentage of the aircraft that's actually full of passengers. And that is a metric that the airlines, it's a business model that they use, and what their target load factors are for various flights and segments, and how they schedule flights. That is something that is there is data on historically that you can look at. And so to answer your question, yes, that is something that is tracked per se, based on flights that are scheduled, and also the amount or percentage of that flight that actually was full. Now, to your question as to what that information might bring to the committee in regards to noise, it might be useful. However, I would say that, again, that's a business decision that the airlines, it's pretty fluid, and I would caution against the business model that the airlines had to take during the COVID pandemic and look at that as something that might stay in place moving forward. That's something that I would caution predicting.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Ickes. And Ryan, any other discussion on the COVID-19 impacts on operations and cargo and in-plane passengers? Seeing none, we will move on to the fourth quarter Fly Quiet report. We'll stick with Mr. Anderson.
Thank you. We've got the fourth quarter 2021 Fly Quiet program report for O'Hare. This is the report on your existing Fly Quiet program for the months of October, November, and December of 2021. Pages 1 through 4 provides background and overview of the reports. Page 1, we have highlights for Fly Quiet mode for fourth quarter. As you can see in the diagram on the bottom, we had quite a bit of various start and stop times for Fly Quiet mode in fourth quarter. The average start time ended up being 11:31 p.m., while the average stop time was 5:42 a.m. Historically, that stop time has been very consistent. You can see that kind of concentration of purple arrows representing all the individual stop times for Fly Quiet mode throughout the quarter, whereas the start time tends to be a little bit more sporadic and dependent on a number of variables that affect when air traffic can start operating the airport in Fly Quiet mode. So it's a bit telling there on either side of that diagram, whether it be the start or stop time for Fly Quiet mode and how consistent each of those are. So the average time in Fly Quiet mode for the quarter was 6 hours and 11 minutes with an average of 85 operations. Page 2, we have highlights for the operations for fourth quarter. The most used departure runway was 28 right, 48%, almost half of all the operations for the fourth quarter used 28 right for departures, 28 center, 39% of the arrivals. Nighttime operations represented 10% of the overall daily operations. And you can see the breakdown of the different types of carriers, our carrier category. By far the most operations are United and American carriers, 42%, and dedicated cargo representing 29% of the operations in flight quiet mode. Top of page 3 has our quick update highlight on our adherence to the preferential departure flight tracks. 86% stayed within a half nautical mile of our preferential flight path, so a solid B for the quarter. Only 4% deviated greater than a mile, and we'll go into that in much greater detail in the nighttime departure track reports. Page 5 is our nighttime hourly operation report, which breaks down that start and stop times for fly quiet mode for fourth quarter in much greater detail. This shows the start and stop times, the operation levels for each of our nighttime hours between 10 p.m. and 7 a.m. Each bar represents average arrivals and departures for each hour. As you can see, the bar shows fourth quarter arrivals in red and fourth quarter 2021 departures in green on the bottom compared to the same quarter of the previous year, being 2020. And you can see across the board, operation levels for 21, obviously much higher than they were in 2020. So all of the red and green bars are much higher than their comparison yellow and blue bars. On the right hand, on the top, you'll see that arrival demand really dictating when flight quiet mode needs to stop and the airport needs to open up additional runways to handle the arrival demand. The left side showing that kind of departure demand, whether or not the airport can operate in a single or dual departure configuration. And we also see, again, arrival demand quite a bit high as well in some of those shoulder hours after 10 p.m. So again, average duration, of flight quiet was 6 hours and 11 minutes with 85 average daily operations.
Ryan, it looks like only about 40% of the operations are during the fly quiet period, with the remainder 60% on the shoulder hours. Is that typical, or is that getting heavier on the shoulder hours than usual?
Well, again, this graphic is really comparison to that 2020 level, so it's not really a good comparison, but I would say yes. Typically, we do the highest concentration of operations during the overnight hours are in those shoulder hours, being 10 and 11 and 5 and 6, when the airport is either getting their last arrivals or departures out, or their early morning arrivals in. But that's something we can look at back historically and break out where that greatest percentage of operations lie during the hours of the overnight period for flight quiet mode. Did that answer your question, Chairman?
Yeah, thank you.
Page 6 is our runway use report for nighttime. So this is just nighttime, not flight quiet mode, between the hours of 10 and 7 a.m. Again, showing operation levels, average departure and arrivals for fourth quarter 2021, comparing that to the third quarter of 2021. For the fourth quarter, the story is really 28 right and 28 center. As you can see on the chart on the bottom, runway 10 left, 28 right, that piece of pavement was used primarily for the majority of departures for the quarter, 49% when we were in west flow and 16% when we were in east flow. On the arrival side, it was 10 center, 28 center, carrying the lion's share of arrivals. 28 center, 39% of the arrivals in west flow and 17% in east flow. We did see some departures and arrivals on the north airfield 17% of the arrivals on 27 Center, as well as some departures on 9 Center and 27 Center as well. As a reminder, we talked about this in a majority of our committees. 9 right, 27 left finished the construction of the extension in December of 2021. Actually, that's a typo there on the bottom. We got to fix that. It was December 2nd, 2021, not 2022. However, there was additional, as we talked about at the full commission meeting, FAA still needs to do a number of things to get that runway, as well as punch list items that they were still finishing up on 9 Center, 27 Center. So a lot of activity on the North Airfield that has been inhibiting the use of those runways, especially during the overnight hours. So we anticipate to see more operations moving over to that North Airfield during the nighttime. And we'll continue to report on these numbers and watch it closely as we move forward in 2022. Page 7, same runway use report, this time just for flight quiet mode. The operations that occurred during that specific flight quiet mode. Again, runway 10 left, 28 right, predominant runway 4 departures, 36% in west flow, 12% in east flow. On the arrival side, 28 Center, almost half of the arrivals in flight quiet mode occurred on that runway, 46% in west flow, 16% in east flow. We did see some arrivals again and departures again on 9 Center, 27 Center on the North Airfield, but our existing nighttime arrival runway 9 right, 27 left was again closed for the majority of the fourth quarter. So not much use of that runway during the fourth quarter due to construction activity. Page 8 and 9 are our arrival summary reports, nighttime arrival summary reports, where we list all of the air carriers and the actual operation number counts for each on our top 2 arrival runways. So runway 10 Center arrivals is our first report, listing all the air carriers that did operate on that runway in fourth quarter 2021. Again, these are actual counts, not averages. And as you can see, the vast number of operations were our American and United and their associated carriers represented the most amount of operations on runway 10 Center for arrivals. So a total of 825 arrivals in fourth quarter 2021 on runway 10 Center, compared with 328 for the same quarter of the previous year. The same report, except this time for the opposite end of runway 10 Center, 28 Center. This is arrivals on runway 28 Center. Again, the lion's share of operations being handled by American, United, and their carriers. 2,315 operation totals for fourth quarter 2021 for arrivals, compared with 1,831 arrivals in 2020. I do want to point out there are some other carriers. FedEx, for instance, had 116 arrivals on runway 28 Center. Again, that's a total count, not an average per night for the fourth quarter. And as you can see, all of these airlines are broken up as either dedicated cargo or passenger. You can see quite a few are dedicated cargo. However, the passenger carriers represented the vast majority count of operations for this runway for fourth quarter. Page 10 and 11 is our nighttime preferential flight track summary report. And for these reports, we're focusing on the departures instead of arrivals and how well those departures adhered to our preferential flight tracks. We look at the top 2 departure runways for the quarter. For fourth quarter 2021, we're looking at departures on 10 left and 28 right. For 10 left, for fourth quarter 2021, We had an average deviation, you'll see at the bottom, of 0.25. So that's a very good score. Again, we look at, we have three categories for average deviations, and that's green, orange, and red. Green represents a deviation of less than a half nautical mile from that preferential flight path. Orange represents a deviation of a half mile to 1 mile, and red is greater than a mile. So we only have a couple of reds you'll see on the report. And of those reds, they only represent really small handful of actual departures. So no real quote unquote offenders on this report. We have a lot of good adherence. Runway 10 left, as you'll see in a report for the track report we have coming up. This is a runway heading departure, so it's a straight out departure procedure. And so we've had very good adherence for this specific flight quiet preferential flight track departure summary for fourth quarter 2021. Page 11 is the same metric for runway 28 right. Now, as a reminder, 28 right is the preferential flight track has a turn to heading 290 degrees. So this, opposed to runway 10 left, is a flight track with a turn. So we see a little bit of more dispersion on the headings with that have turns rather than the runway heading, which is straight out. However, you can see we still have very good adherence. Average overall for fourth quarter, 0.42, so well below that half mile average that we're looking for. A little bit more dispersion with the oranges, half mile to a mile dispersion, average dispersion for some of the carriers. But what is significant is there are no reds for this quarter. So for runway 28 right with a turn, 20-degree turn to the northwest at 290 degrees, all of the carriers utilizing that preferential flight path stayed within at least a half nautical mile of that path. So a very good report for fourth quarter 2021. The next page, page 12, shows the same information graphically. This is our nighttime departure track report for fourth quarter. Again, we have all the tracks for nighttime as well as flight quiet mode, and they're all color coded. So the operations that occurred in flight quiet mode are color coded as either green, orange, or red, representing their deviation from those preferential flight paths, which those are those lines that we have colored in light blue. And the purple color is any operation that occurred outside of flight quiet mode. And then we also have track shown in white, and those are operations that occurred on runways 9 center, 10, 27 center, as well as 10 center, 28 center that do not have preferential flight tracks. But again, as you can see, very good adherence, along with some dispersion on the runways that were used, especially runway 28 right. 87% of the flights stayed within a half nautical mile of that preferential flight path for fourth quarter. So very good adherence to the flight path. You do see again on for runway 22 left, that runway wasn't used as much in fourth quarter for nighttime departures. When it was, we did see a bit more dispersion, a bit only just under half stay within that half nautical mile for that procedure. Pages 13 and 14 are our permanent noise monitor reports. Page 13 shows the geographic location of all 40 permanent noise monitors around O'Hare. As a reminder, we installed 3 new permanent noise monitors in Chicago's and wards 39 and 40. Those are on, you'll see those on the east side of the airport, sites 39, 40, and 46. Those were installed in December. So as a result, we don't have average levels for this report for the fourth quarter. So for this report, the nighttime aircraft noise report, you'll start seeing data for those with the first quarter 2022 report. But the remaining 37 monitors, permanent monitors, we do have reportable data for. We do have, again, this is aircraft LEQ versus the other metric that you typically see, aircraft DNL, which we use for a 24-hour average. As this is only showing nighttime, we use the LEQ metric. We do color code these as well, whether the permanent noise monitor has shown a decibel or more increase compared to the same quarter of the previous year. We'll show those in red. If there's a decrease of 1 decibel or more compared to the same quarter, we will show those in green. As you can see, vast number of the permanent noise monitors showing red levels. Of course, this is expected as we are comparing to fourth quarter 2020, where the operation levels were drastically lower than they currently are. Page 15 is our nighttime noise complaint report. These numbers are the amount of verifiable households that made noise complaints for nighttime operations during the fourth quarter of 2021. So a bit different than the noise report that you see in the typical monthly ANOMS report, where this one just carves out only nighttime noise complaints. We also show all 3 months in the quarter, October, November, and December, as well as the total amount of complaints for fourth quarter. For each month, October, there were 309 verifiable households that made complaints, 187 in November, and 181 in December, totaling 18,007 complaints. As you can see, that was trending a bit downward through the winter months. And we do have a number of communities that we did see a reduction in comparing October, November, December. That may be a result of, as we've seen over the winter months, we shift to predominantly west flow operations in the winter months due to seasonal winds, and that may be a reflection of that. You'll see Chicago, 119 verifiable households making complaints in October versus 63 in December. Park Ridge, 65 in October versus 27 in December. Page 16 is our airline ground run-up reports. This report shows the number of run-ups that occurred at the airport and how many of those occurred within our ground run-up enclosure. We had a very good score for fourth quarter 2020. We had a total of 256 run-ups that occurred, and we track these all hours of the day, not just nighttime. And 93% of those occurred within the GRE. So this is what we want to see. Of course, we'd like all of them to occur within the GRE, but 93% is a very good number. And so you can see that broken out by each of the major carriers that do ground run-ups at the airport, and what percentage of their run-ups occurred within the GRE. Page 17, same information, but broken out by aircraft type. Again, 254 total run-ups for fourth quarter 2021. 93% of those, or 236, occurred within the GRE. You can see some of the narrow body and regional size aircraft tend to have majority, if not all, of their run-ups occur within the GRE. Some of the larger aircraft, we do see a bit of run-ups occurring outside of the GRE, but you'll see here a 777, which is a large aircraft that had one run-up, and that run-up did occur in the GRE, so we'd like to see that. And then, of course, the smaller regional jets, almost 100%, if not all of them, occurred within the GRE. Occasionally, they may, reasons for not using the GRE at the time are broken down into several variables. That could be the GRE was actually being used by another aircraft versus wind conditions. The GRE can accommodate run-ups for the vast majority of wind conditions at the airport, but there are certain wind conditions that will need to be the aircraft will need to do the run up in a different location, or the aircraft size, they may not have the manpower to handle the aircraft size to take it into the GRE at that time. But a very good report for fourth quarter 2021. And then our final report is just informational for the committee that we've started putting in that shows the actual start and stop times of flight quiet mode for each night in fourth quarter 2021, as well as the duration and the number of arrivals and departures for each night. So if you're interested in looking at when flight quiet mode starts and stops throughout the fourth quarter, our flight quiet daily log is provided for that information. And that completes the fourth quarter 2021 flight quiet program report.
Thank you, Ryan. That was a very informative report. As always, does anyone have questions for Ryan on the fourth quarter flight quiet report? Seeing none, we will segue right into the fly quiet awards. Building off the report, Ryan, you had some updates to that.
Yes, and before we get started, let me pull this up. Okay, so just a reminder where we're at with the flight quiet program recognition. This committee has settled on 4 metrics to be used for scoring adherence to your current flight quiet program. We've talked about these over the last several committee meetings, so I'm not going to go back into too much detail, but I do want to highlight a couple things that we want to talk about today. So we have the fleet quality. That's basically the type of aircraft an airline is using that is specifically being flown into O'Hare, and how are those types of aircraft the latest and greatest when it comes to noise impacts. The schedule of the airline operating at O'Hare, do they operate majority during the day or at the night? Obviously, this committee prefers airlines to schedule the bulk of their operations during the day, and so this score would penalize anyone that operates heavily at night. Preferential flight tracks, how well each airline adheres to those preferential flight paths that we have that we just talked about in our report. And then we look at that on an annual basis versus quarterly and give a score for each airline, and ground run-ups. If the airline needs to do a run-up at the airport, are they doing it within the GRE? And so those airlines that do majority of their run-ups within the GRE will get a better score than those that don't do run-ups in the GRE. A couple of things I want to talk about today are when it comes to these, we're going to look at these metrics and how they play out with 2021 data. So we've culminated all the data for 2021. We've applied these scores, these weighting metrics, and so we're going to look at how that plays out as far as which airlines are doing the best according to these metrics and those that aren't. And I also want to talk about how some of these metrics are affecting the score. And then what we really need at this point from the committee is let us know, do you have any further changes you want to make to these metrics? Number one. Number two, if not, is this committee looking to apply this scoring to give out an award for 2021, or is this something the committee would like to track and track airlines' progress on these metrics throughout 2022 and give a score for 2022? That's something for this. We need feedback from the committee, as well as what information you would like as far as an award, quote unquote, package. We need to come up with kind of a report that explains easily these metrics, as well as why we're acknowledging a particular airline for doing well. And so that's something we need to draft up and present to this committee and get the committee comfortable with, that this is kind of the quote unquote reward that we're going to be distributing. And so getting into that, I do want to pull the curtain back a little bit and show you some of the things we've been working on as far as the data, as well as some thoughts on how you can continue to track on an ongoing basis and report this data. And so let me pause the share on this and pull up another screen here. Now, before I show this, I need to emphasize that this is for discussion only still. This is a demonstration data website I'm going to show you. The scoring here is not to be taken away in any fashion that this is the winner and this is the loser for 2021. So again, this is still draft and still subject to change. I guess what I'm saying is that if there's an airline watching or watches this, I don't want them to think that they're getting in trouble for something. We're still working on the data. Okay, so this is, some of you may be familiar with a product called Microsoft Power BI, or there's other products out there called Tableau. Anyway, it's kind of useful technology being able to visualize as well as work with data in a really easy way. And so what I have here is the summary report that you've all seen before. It's just a little bit different because I'm able to manipulate it in real time as versus something that's static. So we can kind of talk through it a little bit. A couple things I want to point out. First, this is your summary score for 2021 based on all of those metrics. And so on first face, if we were to apply those metrics as they were and look at data for 2021, you'll see that we have the airline listed on the left here. We have the type of airline. We have 3 categories for our airlines, they being regional, represented by R, cargo represented by C, and air carrier or passenger represented by P. We have the average daily operations, so the total average daily operations those airlines operate at O'Hare, as well as the average nighttime operations. And so for this report, we are only looking at airlines that have operated at least one average operation per night. And then we also have that percentage of their operation levels. So for instance, the first airline here, Piedmont Airlines, only 10% of their flights occurred during nighttime versus if you scroll down, you'll see Spirit Airlines, 24% of their operations occurred during nighttime. And so, and then as we scroll to the right, we have our 4 metrics, the total fleet quality score, which we've weighted, given a 20-point weighting. Piedmont Airlines, their entire fleet is the latest and greatest. Their entire fleet is small, quiet aircraft. So they got perfect score for fleet quality. 90%, this is basically just and if you think of it as an inverse of the percent of nighttime operations. And so they got a 90% because 90% of their operations occur during the day. They had a track deviation score of 100%. And so that means that this airline, when it flew on a runway in flight quiet mode that has a preferential flight path, it stayed within at least a half nautical mile on average in the entire fourth quarter of 2021. And then the GRE metric being, did the airline do any run-ups during the 2021? And if so, did they occur within the GRE? Piedmont Airlines, we can look at this later, but I'm pretty sure they didn't do any run-ups. And so as we talked about in the past with this metric, any airline that does not do run-ups at the airport is going to get a 100-point score. It's the ones that you'll see here. United Airlines, they had 68% of their run-ups occur within the GRE. So they had several that occurred without, and so that represents their score there. And then we average all of our scores together, and we have a total flight quiet score. So based on all these current metrics, based on looking all of these air carriers as I described, Piedmont Airlines, which is a smaller regional carrier, got a score of 97% for the flight quiet score. Now, before we start talking about this, I do want to show a couple things. One, we can, one of the things I want this committee to think about is when it comes to the flight quiet recognition and how you're allocating these scores, do you want to look at it right now based on all of our airlines, or do we split it up into 3 different categories and possibly give 3 different awards depending on the type of carrier, or 2, whether it be a regional or air carrier, cargo. So for instance, if I were to take out the regional airlines and the cargo airlines, you'll see now that Delta Airlines, if we're just comparing dedicated passenger mainline carriers, you can see that Delta comes out on top, 87% total flight quiet score. And again, you'll see some of the reasons why they came out on top. That GRE use, again, because of not all the airlines use or do run-ups at the airport, we've weighted this very low. It's only weighted 5 points. Their track deviation score, which is weighted the most, 40 points, they had 88%, so very, very good adherence to our deviation flight paths. Our preferential flight paths. 87% of their operations at O'Hare occur during daytime hours versus nighttime. So vast majority of their operations are scheduled during the day, and they have a very good fleet quality score. Their fleet that operates, again, this is operating at O'Hare, is using the latest and greatest types of aircraft with the lowest or the best noise categories. And so for a total of 87%. And then you can also look at, as you look at the bottom, who in this draft, who did the worst. And you can see we have Volaris and Viva Aerobus, who are both our discount Mexican airlines. And you can see that some of the reasons why they did not do good is they had majority of their operations are scheduled at night. Now you can see compared to United or American, they have a much lower number of operations at night. However, they're all majority scheduled during the nighttime hours, number one. Number two, they don't have a great fleet quality score. It's not the worst, but it's also not the best. So their night flight score, so the representation of the count of aircraft that occur at night is low. And also their adherence to our flight paths is they got a C for both airlines. So as a result, you extrapolate those out, and the weightings for each of those categories, low scores for Volaris and Viva Aerobus. Okay, and so this is how we can look at each of this data, breaking it out, either including all carriers or breaking it out into either single by cargo or by mainline carrier or by regional. So, Mr. Chair, before we go into further detail on these reports, are there any questions? And I do want to mention that this is something we are thinking about in a way of this data being available publicly on an ongoing basis. We're not quite there yet, and seeing if that's something that is for sure that we can do. But the thought is that perhaps we can have updated data like this, whether it be interactive or static, on the website on a quarterly basis throughout the year. So every quarter, when we publish the Flight Quiet report, we will also publish the latest update to the Flight Quiet recognition score. And so not only this committee, as well as the public and the airlines, can track and see how the airlines are doing throughout the year. So when it comes to the end of the year, it should be no surprise who's coming on top and who may be at the bottom.
So I think that's an important point. Transparency has always been very important to this process. I credit a lot of that to Mr. Frame for cueing us in on making sure we're using quantifiable data rather than just picking airlines we like. So I would encourage the committee to endorse a plan which makes this as transparent as possible with continual reporting. This is very easy to read, this chart right here, and I think it's pretty helpful. With respect to the data quality, can we go back just to the air carriers themselves? A couple of those looked intriguing to me.
Again, my big caveat at the beginning that this is still draft, so we might see some issues with some of the numbers here, and so we're still making sure that everything is working as it should. So if something stands out to you, let me know. We can.
Yeah, no, and I want to be collaborative in this. I want to try to poke holes in this before we go public with it, just to make sure that it's useful data once we are public with it. Qatar and Turkish Airlines.
Yes.
Are we sure all those are passenger, or are those going to be cargo as well? Because those numbers seem a little high.
Yeah, so we're fairly confident in that. And so what we do is we really drill down in the data and look at actual aircraft registration and tail numbers. And we know that certain aircraft are set up for dedicated cargo only. They can't be used, mixed. You can't, it's not like they're swapping seats out, at a destination. So we'll double check that and make sure, but we're pretty confident that we've isolated those actual aircraft that are cargo only and carve those out of this number.
All right, thank you. Just want to make sure that's accurate. So I do want to kind of have somewhat of a short yet robust conversation with this from the committee. I want to get some input, and I see Mr. Ickes has his hand up, so I'll cede the floor to him.
Yes, it seems like some of these, there's very little difference in the score. They're 1 or 2 percentage points. And if we grant an accolade to someone who's just 1 or 2 percentage points better than the other airline, it seemed like we're missing the big picture. Maybe we could group some of these airlines. If there's less than a 3 or 4 or 5 percentage point difference, they're basically the same. So maybe if we can expand this to recognize the best, as a group, and mention 3 or 4 or 5 airlines and say, you all performed admirably, rather than just single out. I have nothing against Piedmont Airlines at 97%. They sound great, but it's a very small airline and has a very small impact with the total number of flights. So if that makes any sense at all to anybody.
It does, and that is a very good point, and it's something that with this data we thought about. So you see it, the Flight Quiet total Flight Quiet score we've color coded, and for this one, just to pick a grouping, we thought maybe, to your point, maybe everyone that scores 90% or better, maybe quote unquote, the good group, or the ones you really want to give allocates to. And so instead of just possibly, Piedmont is the best, maybe Air Wisconsin, Envoy, and Piedmont all did very, very well, and they're all deserving of recognition for that. So whether or not it's 90% or some other cutoff is something this kind of committee needs to think about, and especially in line or in consideration of some of the questions I asked. But it is a valid thought, Frank.
It would be almost like grading on a J curve. where, if a small minority of the total number does great, then recognize all of them for doing great. And, just spread it out. I'd rather have more friends out there in airlines than just one.
Chairperson Robles.
So I don't disagree with what Frank is saying, but at the same time, and so I think we should recognize above a certain threshold. I think it makes a lot of sense to congratulate multiple airlines who are doing well in helping us try to keep things quiet in the overnight hours. At the same time, I like that there isn't a super big spread, because I think that 1 or 2 percentage points makes it achievable that with minor tweaks, airlines could move up in the rankings. And I think that can be a good motivator. And so I'd actually like to see us do both, where we call out the top airlines. I like breaking it down by category. I think it reflects the different operations of the different carriers. So call out kind of the top, but then also establish that threshold where we say, a special shout out and recognition to those who are helping us and partnering with us through their operational choices.
Thank you. I think I tend to agree with that approach. I'm a good blue-blooded American where I believe that there are winners and losers and profits made at the margin. So, in the Olympics, we have people winning a 100-yard dash by 0.04 of a second. We can have winners, but I think we can also have honorable mentions, those that did a heck of a job getting near the top but not achieving the top spot. Any other feedback?
Yeah, just one little ism. I used to work with a lot of people that said, if you don't do anything, you won't make any mistakes. So apply that to this. I think the airlines that have the most operations that do well are better than an airline that has very few operations, but that does great. If it makes sense.
Noted. It's valid. It's a valid point. But I think we could probably achieve both goals by having a winner as well as honorable mentions or a ranking or something of that sort. Does everyone agree that we should be breaking this into 3 categories as Karen suggested? I think I tend to like that. Is there any objection to that?
No, it's a
No, I
good
think it's a
idea.
good idea. Good idea.
Thanks, Brian. John. And then whether we apply this to 2021 or 2022, that's probably more of a discussion we can have too. I think it is a little odd to give people awards for things they didn't know they were competing in. Congratulations, you won, and I didn't do anything. That said, we could also hit the ground running and award it 2021. Any feedback on that? Should we apply this to 2022 or look back at 2021?
I would apply it to 2022. I agree. I think we should roll it out. And then I like the idea of doing touch points throughout the year so that the airlines know. They also plan so far in advance for their operations. I think if we roll out a 2022 award now, the airlines can maybe be thinking about that as they make decisions for the second half of the year.
That's a good point. You can book a 2023 flight right now if you wanted to. Any objection to applying this to 2022? So let's spend 2022 marketing this, and then we can do a look back in first quarter 2023 at the 2022 results. Does that timeline make sense to you, Ryan?
Yes, I think so. Assuming that there are no further changes to the metrics, and you're all good with it, then I don't see why not we can start reporting on the numbers and start, working with you and making sure getting the word out that this is something you're going to be tracking throughout this year, with the hopes of giving recognition first quarter of next year.
Yeah, I think we need to also not just post it. We need to educate the airlines who we are, what we're doing, and why we're doing it, and then what the metrics are. Do we have a way to outreach the airlines directly?
We do, and Aaron and I can talk about that. There is a group that meets monthly, and this would be a good topic to bring to them in one of the future groups, Aaron. focus groups that has representations of all the carriers that operate at O'Hare. So we do have a forum to bring this to. I just need to talk to Aaron as to when we would do that, I think.
Okay, and then my final point is, would you mind if I assigned my consultant Ron Seymour to try to poke holes in this just as a third party?
Yes, I always, when it comes to data, I prefer to find the holes sooner rather than later. So
I agree. So Ron, you're released to spend a couple hours poking around. All right, any other feedback on this?
And with the data, I do want to, something I want to highlight. And this is something that Dan Dwyer did bring up at the last meeting, and I want to make sure the committee understands. And so this page I've broken out. It's got two of the metrics here, deviations as well as GRUs, but I want to focus on deviations. So right now, how the scoring is working for your nighttime flight path deviations is we've got the three different categories that we're, for lack of a better word, we're calling good, marginal, and poor. So poor is flights that occurred that deviated 1 nautical mile or more from our preferential flight paths. Marginal is they stayed within a half mile to a mile, and good is they stayed under a half mile. Now, as you can see how the metric works, gives a score or percentage of the total that occurred less than a half a mile. And this is what Dan did bring attention to, that the way this metric currently is for your current flight quiet program, it is awarding airlines that adhere as close as they can to that preferential flight path, which is in the spirit of what this current flight quiet program has. Now, that compared with the discussions we are having in the flight quiet committee, that is has started to champion dispersion and the benefits of dispersion. That this may be counterproductive towards that. At least I think that was Dan's point. And so I just want to make sure the committee is aware that this is how this metric is set up. And what I would say to how this metric may possibly be a deterrent to dispersion is that you're going to, with vector headings, and this is something we've talked about at length in both this committee as well as flight quiet committee, with traditional vector heading percent, because the pilot and the air are the variables that make it different for each particular flight, whereas a computer flying the airplane on a very specific procedure is the opposite of that, where it's going to be little to no dispersion. So you're still going to have dispersion, and you're still going to see aircraft occur flights outside of that good less than half nautical mile. It's just the point of maybe we don't mind it as much, that mile to a half mile. Maybe we want to look at this as incorporating some sort of score that melds both good and marginal, whereas calling out poor is really what you want to focus on. So I hope I explained that okay. And if I just want to make sure the committee understands this metric.
So assuming we have two headings in the fly quiet rotation plan, I would assume that means we have two preferential headings in the fly quiet
Correct.
program.
Correct.
Okay. Does anyone have any feedback on the deviation? And I would invite Mr. Dwyer to speak if he so chooses. All right, seeing none. Oh, Dan, you have anything?
Sorry. I was just trying to understand. I thought the deviation was a penalty as soon as you got a fraction of a nautical mile off. So what you're saying is you've grouped it into three categories.
Correct.
Weight them. Okay. That's far better than what I feared. I feared it would be as soon as you went even a fraction of a nautical mile off. So I think that's a good compromise. I'll leave it to the committee to decide the best weighting on that. But thank you for the clarification.
And thank you for bringing that to our attention, Dan, and the resolution, Ryan. Much appreciated.
Mhm.
Any other feedback on deviations? Ryan, do you have what you need as far as marching orders? Do we need to take a vote on this?
No, I think the next steps are, we formulate internally best way to start tracking this, as well as I think, Mr. Chair, maybe we meet outside of this committee and start strategizing as far as outreach and when that might occur with the airlines. So I think for today, we have plenty to go on to keep moving forward.
Yeah, and I would look to your expertise as well as CDA's expertise on that airline outreach. Is something I'm not well versed in, but I'm happy to listen to.
Okay.
All right, wrapping up the robust conversation on our flight by recognition program, we will move on to our report from the Ad Hoc Daytime Noise Insight Subcommittee. That's a mouthful, Mr. Kazar.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Good morning, everyone. The Ad Hoc Daytime Noise Subcommittee met for its second meeting on Thursday, March 10th at 9 o'clock via Zoom. Main subject of the meeting was a presentation by Mr. Anderson of Lander and Brown on the differences between the daytime and nighttime operations at O'Hare. Report clearly shows the challenges the subcommittee faces in trying to address any potential noise mitigation from the operational side of the equation. Subcommittee is going to spend the next several meetings focusing on one major issue at a time, with wind likely being the next issue being discussed. In addition, based on Mr. Anderson's input, a work plan is being developed to address issues already in the queue, as well as new issues offered and by subcommittee members. Chair wants to publicly thank Mr. Anderson as well as Interim Executive Director Ms. Morel Mantanani for their efforts and input. The next subcommittee meeting will be, in person on Thursday, April 14th at 9 o'clock at Park Ridge City Hall. Public thank you is also offered to the City of Park Ridge and Mayor Marty Maloney for offering the use of City Council chambers. Mr. Chairman, that concludes my report.
Thank you, Ernie. That fits well into my next statement. The next ONCC Technical Committee meeting will be held April 19th in person at Bensonville Village Hall. I appreciate ONCC's initiative to start spreading out these meetings into the communities most impacted. I think it's a great initiative and it cuts down on my commute first and foremost. Do we have any comments from ONCC members? Seeing none, comments from the audience.
Mr. Dwyer has a comment.
Mr. Dwyer.
Back again for round two. Just looking well ahead to possible rotation and the complexities that adds to the awards program. Trying to understand how you would score non-preferential but designated. And I'm going to take one example. Currently, there's a 25-degree heading off 28C in both B or H. That's preferential, but you can request 28R, which is designated but not preferential, and that has a different heading of 10 degrees. And then on top of that, you have non-designated, which is neither of those. And it seems like that category would need some consideration of expansion to consider those. Now, for current fly quiet, the rotation doesn't exist, but just thinking ahead as to how that, because that's what really, to me, ties in with the lived experience of the residents. It isn't whether they complied with the preferential, it's those other two factors that disrupt the intent of the rotation. But thank you.
I appreciate the nuance there. I will not ask for a rebuttal from Mr. Anderson until he can formulate a good solution for that, which I'm sure him and his staff are more than capable of coming up with.
Thank you.
Any other comments from the audience? Seeing none, I will seek a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
You have a second? Second from Brian. Thank you. Maura, can you please call the roll?
Arlington Heights,
Yes.
Bensonville,
Yes.
City of Chicago 39th Ward,
Yes.
41st Ward,
Yes.
Hanover Park,
Yes.
Harwood Heights,
Yes.
Itasca,
Yes.
Mount Prospect,
Yes.
Norwich,
Yes.
Park Ridge,
Yes.
River Grove,
Yes.
Schaumburg.
Yes.
Did I miss anyone? Okay, we're adjourned.
Thank you for everyone's time. This meeting is adjourned.
Thank you.
You.
Bye all.
Bye-bye.